The fog didn't just cling to the skeletal pines of the Hürtgen Forest. It devoured them. It was a cold, wet, gray shroud that blurred the line between earth and sky, deadening sound and amplifying the frantic beat of a heart. Inside the steel belly of the M4 Sherman tank, nicknamed Fortune's Fool, the world was reduced to a symphony of dread. The air was thick with the smells of cold oil, cordite, and the sharp tang of sweat-soaked wool. Sergeant Jack Miller's breath plumed in the frozen air. His eye pressed to the gunner's scope, seeing nothing but a wall of shifting gray. Then came the sound. A low, grinding rumble that vibrated up through the frozen mud and into the very bones of the tank. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a Panzer IV. This was deeper, heavier. A sound like a mountain being torn apart. The commander, Lieutenant Evans, crouched in the cupola, his voice a tight crackle over the intercom. Contacts. Multiple engine sounds. Bearing 270. Range unknown. Jack's hands tightened on the traversing handles. His world narrowed to the crosshairs of his sight. The rumble grew, splitting into distinct, terrifying threads. 1, 2, 3, 5. Maybe more. The fog began to spit dark shapes. Impossibly large, with long, deadly barrels that seemed to sniff the air like the snouts of prehistoric beasts. Tiger tanks. A full convoy of them, their slab-sided armor glistening with moisture, their tracks churning the deep ruts of the forest road into black soup. "God in heaven," whispered Private Riley, the loader, his hands frozen on a high-explosive shell he knew was useless. A voice, thin and distorted by static, broke over the radio. "Anvil, this is Hammer. We are not in position. Repeat, we are not in position. You are the Anvil. Hold them. You must hold them." They were alone. 5 Shermans against a pack of Tigers. A mismatch so profound it was almost comical. A direct hit from their 76mm gun might scratch the paint on a Tiger's frontal armor at this range. A hit from the Tiger's 88mm gun would turn Fortune's Fool into a molten coffin. The lead Tiger's turret began to traverse, its massive guns searching for the source of the American engine noise. It was slow, deliberate, the movement of a predator that knew it had all the time in the world. Jack felt the eyes of his crew on him. The loader, the driver, the commander. They were waiting for a miracle. The Tiger's gun stopped moving. Its barrel was pointed directly at them. And in that frozen second, with death staring him down, Jack Miller's mind didn't race forward, but back. Back to the sun-baked plains of Kansas, to the smell of cut wheat, and to the one man who had taught him that being straight wasn't always true, and being crooked wasn't always wrong. Before we discover how Jack Miller and his crew could possibly survive this point-blank encounter with the most feared tank of the war, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. This true story of impossible courage and a forgotten tactical genius is the kind of tale that changes how you see history, and you won't want to miss what happens next. 10 years earlier, and a world away, the Kansas sun was a merciless bronze coin in a sky so vast it felt like a physical presence. The air hummed with the song of cicadas and the distant, rhythmic groan of an oil pump jack. 8-year-old Jack Miller sat in the dust behind his family's farmhouse, his small hands struggling with a heavy, rusted iron bar. His entire world was defined by the Flint Hills, an endless rolling sea of grass where the horizon was a perfect, unbroken line. His father, Thomas Miller, was a man of few words and calloused hands. He wasn't a farmer, but the land's mechanic, the man who kept the complex machinery of the local oil fields running. He stood over Jack now, a silent silhouette against the sun. "It's bent," Jack finally said, his voice small. The iron bar was indeed warped, twisted slightly but unmistakably along its length. "I know," his father replied, his voice a low rumble. "Now, I want you to hit that marker post 50 yards out. The one with the red cloth." Jack frowned. He hefted the bar, took clumsy aim, and threw it. It tumbled end over end, landing a good 10 feet to the left of the post. "I missed," he said, stating the obvious. Thomas Miller walked over, picked up the bar, and held it. He didn't look at Jack, but at the bar itself. "The bar is straight in your hand, son. You threw it straight. But it flew crooked." "Why?" Jack shrugged. "Because it's bent." "Exactly. The flaw is in the tool, not the user. But what if you knew the flaw? What if you could measure it, understand it? His father turned, his eyes sharp. Now, don't aim for the post. Aim for that scrub bush to the left of it. The one the bar almost hit. Confused, Jack took the bar back. He looked at the bush, then at the post. It felt wrong, illogical. But he trusted his father. He focused on the scrub bush, drew back, and threw. The bar spun through the air, its crooked flight path a familiar sight, but this time it slammed directly into the marker post with a dull, satisfying thwack. Jack stared, his mouth agape. His father placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. Remember this, Jack. The world is full of straight barrels and crooked ones. Most men spend their lives trying to straighten the crooked barrel. A smart man learns to use the curve. It was a lesson in perception, in understanding that the system, whether it was a thrown bar or a fired shell, was never perfect. True accuracy came not from pretending the imperfections didn't exist, but from knowing them so intimately you could use them to your advantage. It was a philosophy that would become the bedrock of Jack's life, a secret language between him and the physical world. A language that, one day, would have to speak in the grammar of violence and survival. As the years passed, the lessons continued. The dusty yard behind the Miller house became an open-air classroom of practical physics. Thomas Miller was a natural teacher, his pedagogy written in grease and solved with torque. He had Jack sighting targets with a rifle that had a slightly warbed stock, teaching him how to compensate, to feel the weapon's unique personality. He showed him how a pump jack's arm, if misaligned by a single degree, would wear out its bearings in a month, but if you accounted for that misalignment in your maintenance schedule, it would run for years. Precision isn't about perfection, Jack, his father would say, wiping oil from a gear with a slow, deliberate motion. It's about predictability. You can have a perfect tool that breaks when you need it most, or a flawed tool you know inside and out. I'll take the flawed tool every time. Jack absorbed it all. While other boys were dreaming of being cowboys or pilots, Jack found a deep, quiet satisfaction in solving these mechanical puzzles. He learned to listen to machines, to diagnose their ills by sound and touch. He could tell the health of a truck's engine by the pitch of its idle, sense a worn bearing in a grain silo's conveyor by a vibration you felt through your feet. This intimate, tactile knowledge of the world was his inheritance. It was forged in the fire of a single, terrifying event. Jack was 14, helping his father repair a massive, hydraulic piston on a drilling rig. A faulty seal blew without warning, releasing a jet of high-pressure fluid that sliced through the air like a razor. Thomas shoved Jack out of the way, but the whip-like spray caught his own arm, tearing through flesh and muscle. The sight of his father's blood, the shocking brightness of it against the gray steel, was seared into Jack's memory. As he frantically applied a tourniquet, his hands shaking but his mind clear, his father, pale and sweating, had looked at him. "See," he grunted through clenched teeth. "The flaw in the seal. We didn't see it, but we adapt. We survive. You remember, Jack. You remember the curve." The ambulance ride, the hospital lights, the long silence that followed, it all cemented the lesson. The world was not safe. It was not perfect. It was a collection of systems, some benevolent, most indifferent, and some, like that failed seal, lethally flawed. His father survived, but his right arm was never the same. The incident didn't make Jack fearful. It made him vigilant. It made him a student of failure, always looking for the hidden stress point, the unseen crack, the inherent curve in every seemingly straight line. The war felt distant in Kansas, a rumbling storm on the other side of the world reported by crackling radios and stark newspaper headlines. But in the spring of 1943, the storm reached the Miller farm. The letter arrived in a crisp, official envelope. Jack's draft notice. He was to report to Fort Leavenworth for induction. The night before he left, he and his father sat on the porch, watching the fireflies blink in the gathering darkness. The air was heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and unspoken words. "They'll put you in a tank, most likely," his father said finally, his voice quiet. "With your mechanic's mind." Jack just nodded, staring at his hands. "They'll teach you to shoot straight. By the book." Thomas Miller turned to look at his son, his face etched in the twilight. Their book. The Army's book is written for straight barrels, son. It assumes every tool is perfect, every soldier is the same. It doesn't account for the curve. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It was filled with his tight, precise handwriting, diagrams, formulas, observations from a lifetime of working with flawed machinery. "This is my book," he said, pressing it into Jack's hands. "You take it. You remember what I taught you. When their book fails you, you use mine." The next morning, at the bus depot in Wichita, there were tears from his mother and a firm, prolonged handshake from his father. The last thing Jack saw as the bus pulled away was his father, standing straight and solitary, raising his crippled right hand in a slow, final wave. Jack clutched the notebook in his pocket like a talisman. He was leaving the straight lines of the Kansas plains for a world that was about to prove itself profoundly, terrifyingly crooked. Fort Knox, Kentucky, was a universe of shouted orders, identical uniforms, and relentless routine. It was a machine designed to sand down individual quirks and produce interchangeable parts for a vast army. For Jack, it was a study in frustration. He was a natural with machinery, easily mastering the complexities of the M4 Sherman's engine, transmission, and suspension. But it was on the gunnery range where he clashed with the system. The instructors drilled one mantra into them: consistency. The same sight picture, the same breathing, the same trigger squeeze. The gun was a perfect instrument. Any error was the gunner's error. Jack's tank crew began to take shape. His commander was Lieutenant David Evans, a fresh-faced, by-the-book officer from upstate New York who believed in regulations with a religious fervor. His loader was Private Pete Riley O'Malley, a fast-talking kid from Chicago with quick hands and a quicker wit. His driver was Corporal Samuel Preacher Jones, a quiet, thoughtful man from Alabama who spoke in Bible verses and drove the 30-ton Sherman with the gentle touch of a horseman. On the live-fire range, Jack's crew was assigned a tank, Bouncing Betty. From the first shot, Jack knew something was off. The gun, a 76mm M1A1, was consistently hitting a foot left and low of the target at 500 yards. He reported it to the range instructor, a gruff master sergeant. "The gun is fine, Miller," the sergeant barked. "It's you. Stop flinching." But Jack knew it wasn't him. He spent his evening in the barracks, under the dim lights, poring over his father's notebook. He found sketches, formulas for calculating parabolic drift, notes on metallurgical stress and harmonic vibrations. The next day, he approached Lieutenant Evans. "Sir, request permission to make a minor calibration adjustment to the main gun. I believe the sight is misaligned due to a harmonic flaw in the barrel mounting." Evans stared at him as if he'd spoken in ancient Greek. "Miller, the armorers have calibrated that gun. The manual does not authorize crew-level modifications. You will fire according to standard procedure." Frustration boiled in Jack's chest. He was being forced to throw a straight bar, knowing full well it was bent. For the rest of training, he deliberately aimed off-target, compensating for the gun's flaw based on his own calculations. He hit dead center every time, but his scorebook was marked with demerits for failing to employ standard sighting technique. Evans saw him as a problematic maverick, a soldier who couldn't or wouldn't follow simple orders. The seeds of distrust were sown in the Kentucky clay. The crossing on the troopship was a nauseating, timeless ordeal of crowded holds, bad food, and the ever-present fear of U-boats. They landed in England, where the war became real in the form of blackout curtains and the constant drone of bomber streams heading east. Finally, they were shipped across the Channel to Normandy, months after D-Day, but the war was still very much alive. They were assigned a new tank, the Fortune's Fool. The first thing Jack did, much to Evans's exasperation, was to perform a full diagnostic on the main gun. He fired 3 test rounds at a derelict German half-track. All 3 landed in a tight group, 2 feet left of the aiming point. "See," Evans said, a note of vindication in his voice. "It's you, Miller. It's always been you." "With all due respect, sir," Jack said, his voice tight. "The group is tight. The gun is accurate. It's just not true. The barrel has a slight cant to the left, probably from a manufacturing flaw or transport damage. Let me recalibrate the sight." "Negative, Sergeant," Evans snapped. We do this by the book. You will aim off target as you see fit, but the sight stays as is. I will not have this tank fail an inspection because of your tinkering." The rest of the crew watched the exchange in uneasy silence. Riley trusted Jack's mechanical genius implicitly. Preacher just sighed, murmuring something about a house divided. Jack felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He was going into combat with a weapon he knew was flawed, commanded by a man who valued procedure over performance. He was being sent to fight tigers with a crooked barrel, and the one man who could authorize him to fix it saw his solution as the problem. They moved into the hedgerows of Normandy, and then the push began toward Germany. They saw scattered action, supporting infantry, engaging the occasional German anti-tank gun. Jack's method worked. He consistently hit his targets by aiming where he knew the shell would go, not where the sight told him it should. But with every successful engagement, the tension between him and Evans grew. The lieutenant's by-the-book successes were, in reality, built on Jack's by-the-gut corrections. It was a secret flaw in their own team, a hairline crack in their steel shell, and Jack knew it was only a matter of time before the pressure found it. The tension between Miller's genius and his commander's rigid adherence to the rules is about to be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. If you're appreciating this deep dive into the psychology of a soldier, hit the like button and let me know in the comments. It truly helps support the channel. Now, back to the frozen hell of the Hürtgen Forest. The Hürtgen Forest was unlike anything they could have imagined. It was a primeval, brooding place where the sun was a forgotten memory. Giant fir trees, their branches interlaced like a ragged roof, blocked out the sky, casting a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. The ground was a frozen bog of mud, pine needles, and decaying leaves, churned into a foul slurry by thousands of boots and tracks. The cold was a physical presence, a damp, biting chill that seeped through layers of wool and leather to settle deep in the marrow. They moved up a narrow, muddy track, the Shermans groaning in protest. The trees were so close their branches screeched against the sides of the tanks, a sound like fingernails on a colossal chalkboard. Every corner was a potential ambush. The Germans weren't just in front of them, they were all around. They had sown the forest with a devil's garden of mines, teller mines, Schumanns that jumped to waist height before detonating. Booby traps hung from branches, and snipers, invisible in the dense canopy, could pick a man off from 20 yards without ever being seen. The constant shelling was the worst. German artillery, pre-registered on every trail and clearing, would rain down without warning. There was no digging in. The roots of the great firs were like steel cables. A direct hit would not just kill men, it would vaporize them, leaving behind only a red stain in the mud and a collection of dog tags. The forest was a meat grinder. Replacements would arrive with fresh faces and clean uniforms, and within days, their eyes would hold the same hollow, thousand-yard stare. Fortune's Fool became their world, a damp, steel island in a sea of mud and death. The air inside was permanently laced with the smell of damp earth, cold metal, and the faint, coppery scent of fear. Sleep was a fugue state, snatched in the driver's seat or slumped against the cold turret wall, punctuated by the crack of sniper fire or the sudden, earth-shaking crump of a mortar round. They were always wet, always cold, always tired. This was the impossible problem. Not a battle, but a slow, grinding consumption by a landscape that seemed to be actively, maliciously alive and on the side of the enemy. The German defenders were ghosts. They were the Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers, and Volksgrenadier units, dug into concrete bunkers and log-reinforced fighting positions that were all but invisible until you were right on top of them. They knew the forest intimately. They had prepared kill zones covering every conceivable approach, with interlocking fields of machine gun and Panzerfaust fire. The American advance, measured in yards per day, was a brutal, attritional nightmare. Tanks were death traps in the close confines. A Sherman would nudge its way around a bend, and from a hole in the ground not 50 feet away, a Panzerfaust team would rise, fire their shaped charge rocket, and disappear back into the earth before the tank's machine guns could even traverse. Jack saw it happen to the tank ahead of them. Bad dog. One moment it was there, nosing through a thicket. The next, a brilliant white flash, a sound like a giant can being ripped open, and then the orange flower of an internal explosion blooming from every hatch. The hatches flew open and men emerged, transformed into human torches, their screams lost in the roaring fire. The smell of burning diesel and cooked flesh washed over Fortune's Fool, a stench they would never forget. Lieutenant Evans's voice over the intercom was a strained, high-pitched thing. "Driver, reverse. Reverse." Preacher threw the tank back, its tracks skidding in the mud. Inside, they were silent. The only sound the labored breathing of four men confronting the visceral reality of their own mortality. Riley was praying, a rapid, whispered Hail Mary. Preacher just muttered, "Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." His voice trailed off. Jack said nothing. He stared through his scope, his knuckles white on the handles. He wasn't looking for a target. There was none to see. He was seeing the flaw in the entire system. The Sherman tank was the wrong tool for this environment. It was a straight barrel being thrown into a crooked, close-quarters fight where armor and firepower were neutralized by terrain and stealth. They were playing the enemy's game, by the enemy's rules, and they were losing. Badly. The orders came down on a morning when a freezing rain fell, coating the trees in a brittle, transparent shell of ice. Their battalion, what was left of it, was to push forward and secure a key crossroads deep in the forest, a place the maps called Hell's Highway. Intelligence suggested the Germans were pulling back. It was a lie. They moved out, a column of 8 Shermans and a company of ragged infantry. The forest was unervingly quiet. The usual crump of mortar fire was absent. The only sound was the grind of their own engines and the crunch of their tracks on the frozen ground. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. Fortune's Fool was third in the column. They reached a small clearing where the road widened slightly. It was a perfect spot for an ambush. Jack's instincts were screaming. "Sir, this feels wrong," he said over the intercom. "The acoustics, the engine sounds are echoing funny. It feels like a bowl." "Stick to your job, Miller," Evans replied, his voice tense. "Watch your sector." The lead tank hit a mine. The explosion was deafening, lifting the Sherman's front end off the ground before it settled back, smoke pouring from its hatches. Immediately, the forest erupted. Hidden anti-tank guns opened up from the flanks. The sharp, distinctive crack of the German 75mm Pak-40. 1, 2, 3 Shermans were hit in quick succession, brewing up into fiery pyres. Panzerfaust teams rose from spider holes, firing at point-blank range. "Traverse right. Target, anti-tank gun. 200 yards." Evans yelled, his voice cracking. Jack swung the turret, found the flickering muzzle flash of the Pak-40 through the trees. He fired. The shell screamed away, and through the smoke, he saw the German gun's shield jerk backward. A hit. But it was too late. The column was shattered. The infantry was pinned down, cut to pieces by machine gun fire. Through the chaos, Evans got a garbled radio message. The Germans weren't just defending. A heavy armor unit, a convoy of Tiger tanks, was using the diversion to move up this very road to punch a hole in the American line. Their shattered battalion was all that stood in the way. The order was simple, insane, and final: hold at all costs. Fortune's Fool, along with one other surviving Sherman, Daisy Cutter, found a slightly elevated position where the road bent, creating a natural choke point. They were the Anvil. And the Hammer, a convoy of the most fearsome tanks ever built, was now rolling directly toward them. The 2 surviving Shermans backed into a defensive position among a cluster of thick pines, using the trees for what little concealment they could offer. Daisy Cutter was to their left, partially hidden behind a small, rocky outcrop. The crew of Fortune's Fool worked with a frantic, silent efficiency born of terror. Riley slammed a round into the breach, the metallic clang echoing in the tight space. "Up!" he yelled. Preacher kept the engine running, his hands gripping the steering levers, his foot hovering over the brake. He was positioned for a quick, violent reverse if needed. Evans was half out of the cupola, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the mist-shrouded road ahead. Jack's world was the rubber eyepiece of his M70G telescopic sight. The crosshairs danced over the gray tree trunks, the swirling fog, the dark scar of the road. His mouth was dry. He could feel the sweat trickling down his spine despite the freezing cold. This was it. The first real test. Not against a static gun or a Panzerfaust team, but against the legendary monster itself. "Contact!" Evans screamed. ducking down into the turret. Tiger. Lead vehicle, 300 yards. Miller, load AP. On the way. Riley confirmed, hefting a heavy armor-piercing round. The Tiger emerged from the fog like a dragon from its lair. It was immense, a moving fortress of steel. Its long 88mm gun seemed to dominate the landscape. Jack centered the crosshairs on the driver's viewport, the supposed weak spot. But he knew the truth. At this angle and range, it was like throwing a pebble at a bank vault door. Fire! Evans commanded. Jack took a breath, let it half out, and squeezed the trigger. The tank rocked back with a violent recoil. The shell flew true, for his crooked gun. It struck the Tiger's front glassy plate with a brilliant orange spark and a sound like a cathedral bell being struck by a sledgehammer. For a heart-stopping second, they waited. The spark dissipated. Where the shell had hit, there was a small, black smudge on the German gray paint. Nothing more. The Tiger hadn't even slowed down. "You missed," Evans shouted, a note of panic in his voice. "I didn't miss, sir," Jack said, his voice eerily calm. It bounced right off. As if to prove his point, the Tiger's turret began to traverse. It was a slow, deliberate, terrifying movement. It was not aiming at Fortune's Fool. It was aiming at Daisy Cutter. The world seemed to slow down. Jack watched, helpless, as the Tiger's massive gun flashed. There was no sound of impact, just a cataclysmic explosion as Daisy Cutter ceased to be a tank and became an expanding ball of fire and shrapnel. The turret was blown clean off its ring, spinning into the air in a lazy, horrifying arc before crashing down through the pine canopy. Pieces of steel plate and equipment rained down for what felt like minutes. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackle of the burning hull. They were alone. The Tiger's turret began to traverse back toward them. It was their turn. "Driver, reverse. Hard reverse," Evans yelled. Preacher threw the tank backward. At that moment, a movement in the trees to their right caught Jack's eye. A German infantryman, white camouflage smock over his field gray, stood up, a Panzerfaust 60 on his shoulder. He was at point-blank range, no more than 30 yards away. "Infantry right!" Jack screamed, swinging the coaxial machine gun toward the threat. It was too late. The Panzerfaust fired with a whoosh of rocket propulsion and a blast of flame from the rear of the tube. The shape-charge warhead crossed the short distance in an eye blink and struck Fortune's Fool on the right side of the hull, just below the turret. The impact was like being inside a bell that had been struck by a giant. The concussion was deafening. The interior of the tank filled with acrid smoke and the scream of tortured metal. A jet of white-hot plasma from the warhead pierced the armor, slicing through the radio and the ready ammunition rack before spending itself against the far side of the fighting compartment. Riley screamed. A piece of red-hot spall, a fragment of the tank's own internal armor, had sliced across his thigh, opening a deep, bloody gash. Electrical systems shorted out, filling the air with the stink of ozone and burning insulation. The engine coughed and died. Preacher fought with the controls. "We're track-locked. Steering's gone. We're dead in the water." Fortune's Fool was crippled. They were sitting ducks, immobile and wounded, facing a fully operational Tiger tank that was now lining up for the kill shot. Smoke poured from the open driver's hatch and the commander's cupola. Evans was coughing, his face blackened. "Report. Damage report. Engine's dead. We can't move." Preacher called out. "Riley's hit. Bad leg wound," Jack said, already ripping his own first aid kit open. He pressed a field dressing against the bloody tear in Riley's trousers. The loader's face was pale, his teeth clenched in pain. Through his sight, Jack saw the Tiger begin its slow, inexorable advance. It knew they were hurt. It was moving in for the final blow. They had seconds. "The gun. Miller, can you fire the gun?" Evans shouted, desperation clawing at his voice. Jack checked the traverse mechanism. It was sluggish, the hydraulic fluid leaking from a severed line, but it still worked. The breech was intact. "Gun is operational. But sir, AP won't penetrate his front armor." "It's useless." Evans's mind was racing, the rulebook offering no solutions for this page. What about the flank? If we can hit his flank. He's coming straight on. We'd need a miracle to get a flank shot. The tiger was 200 yards away now, its engine a low, predatory growl. Its gun began to elevate slightly, aiming for a center-mass shot that would guarantee a kill. And then, Preacher, the quiet driver from Alabama, spoke. His voice was calm, resonant with a strange certainty. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said. "Jack, trust the curve." It was those words, "trust the curve," that cut through the panic. Jack's eyes darted to the road. It was a bend. The tiger, in its arrogance, was staying on the road, its massive bulk confined by the dense trees on either side. As it advanced to point-blank range, its frontal armor would, for just a moment, be presented at a slight angle as it followed the curve of the road. It wasn't a flank shot, but it wasn't a full frontal shot, either. It was an oblique angle. A mathematician's nightmare. A gunner's only hope. "Traverse right. Now!" Jack yelled, his hands flying to the manual traverse wheel, helping the struggling motor. The turret groaned, inching around. "What are you doing, Miller? That's not a target solution." Evans protested. "It's the only one we've got. Riley, AP. Now." Gritting his teeth against the pain, Riley dragged another AP round from the rack and slammed it into the breech. Up. The tiger was 100 yards away. Its gun was leveled. Jack centered his crosshairs not on the center of the mass, but on the leading edge of the front glassy plate, where it met the side hull. He was aiming for the weld seam, the joint. He had to lead the target, to account for the tiger's movement, to account for the curve of the road, and to account for the inherent flaw in his own gun. It was an impossible calculation, done in a split second by gut instinct alone. He fired. The shell screamed across the short distance. It struck the tiger exactly where Jack had aimed, on the angled join between the front and side armor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a jet of flame shot out from the tiger's turret ring. The great beast shuddered to a halt. Its engine revved once, then died. A hatch flew open and black smoke began to pour out. No one emerged. Inside Fortune's Fool, there was a stunned silence, broken only by Riley's pained breathing. They had done it. They had killed a tiger. But there was no time for celebration. Evans, peering through his periscopes, saw the rest of the convoy. The lead tiger was dead, but it was only the first. Behind it, another tiger was nosing past the wreck, its own massive gun searching for the threat that had slain its brother. Another one. Miller. Target. Same shot. Evans yelled, his voice raw. Jack was already traversing. But the second tiger had learned from the first's mistake. It angled its hull sharply, presenting its heavily sloped side armor, a near-impossible target. Jack fired. The shell hit the angled plate and ricocheted harmlessly into the sky with a shriek. The tiger's gun found them. It fired. The 88mm shell passed so close to the cupola that the wind of its passage knocked Evans's helmet off. It slammed into the pine tree directly behind them, exploding and sending a shower of wood splinters and hot shrapnel clattering against their rear deck. They were completely exposed. Their gun was useless against a properly angled tiger. They couldn't move. And the rest of the convoy was stacking up behind the second tank, eager to finish them off. The temporary victory felt hollow, a stay of execution measured in seconds. The true weight of their situation settled over them, cold and heavy as a shroud. The second tiger fired again. This time, it was a high-explosive round, aimed to kill their exposed infantry, the infantry that was already dead or pinned down. The shell detonated just to their left, and the concussion was like a physical blow. Dirt and tree roots rained down on the hull. The tank rocked violently. "We can't take another hit like that," Preacher called out. "The hull's cracked. We're taking on smoke." Evans was on the radio, yelling into a dead handset. "Any station, this is Anvil. We are immobilized and engaged by multiple heavy armor. Request immediate artillery support. Anything. Do you copy?" Only static answered. The Panzerfaust hit had likely destroyed their transmitter. They were cut off. No help was coming. Jack, his ears ringing, kept his eye glued to the sight. The second Tiger was holding position, using the wreck of the first as cover, its gun threatening them but not firing. It was waiting. Then Jack saw why. A third Tiger was moving up on the other side of the road, trying to outflank them. They were being boxed in. "Sir, third tank, trying to get on our left flank," Jack reported, his voice a monotone of exhaustion and strain. "I see it," Evans said, slumping against the turret wall. The rulebook was empty. The procedures had failed. He was out of ideas. The confident young lieutenant from New York was gone, replaced by a terrified boy staring into the abyss. "We're not going to get out of this," he whispered, the words meant for himself but heard by all over the intercom. The words hung in the smoky air, a confession of defeat. It was the most terrifying sound any of them had heard. Riley closed his eyes, his lips moving in silent prayer. Preacher bowed his head. The will to fight was draining from the crippled tank, seeping out into the frozen mud. It was in this moment of collective despair that Jack Miller felt a strange, preternatural calm descend upon him. The fear, the noise, the exhaustion, it all faded into a dull background hum. His father's voice, clear as if he were standing beside him, echoed in his mind. "The world is full of straight barrels and crooked ones. A smart man learns to use the curve." He looked at his gun. The crooked barrel. The flaw. The thing that had gotten him demerits, that had caused tension with his commander, that had been a source of constant friction. It was the only thing he had left. It wasn't a flaw to be corrected. It was a tool to be understood. He knew what he had to do. It was insane. It was against every regulation, every tenet of gunnery. It was the ultimate expression of his father's philosophy. He had to stop fighting the curve, and become the curve. Jack broke the silence, his voice cutting through the gloom with an authority that made Evans flinch. "Preacher, I need you to crank the turret. Manually. 1 mil to the left. On my mark." Evans stared at him. "What? Miller, what are you talking about?" "We have a target. The second Tiger." "We can't kill the second Tiger, sir," Jack said, not taking his eye from the scope. "Not with a direct shot. He's angled. Our AP won't bite. We need a new plan." "There is no new plan." Evans shot back, his fear turning to anger. "There is," Jack said, his voice still eerily calm. "We ignore the second tank." A stunned silence filled the turret. "Ignore it," Riley croaked from the floor. "Jack, it's going to blow us to hell." "Not if we kill the one behind it first," Jack said. "The third Tiger, the one trying to flank us. He's partially hidden behind the wreck of the first, but he has to expose his side to move past. It's a cleaner shot. But I can't get a direct line of sight from this angle. The wreck and the second Tiger are in the way." "So it's impossible," Evans stated flatly. "No, sir," Jack replied, a flicker of his Kansas drawl returning. "It's just crooked." He explained it quickly, the words tumbling out. He couldn't fire straight at the third Tiger. But if he fired at an angle, using the iron-hard trunk of a specific thick pine tree as a ricochet point, he could bank the shot. Like a billiard ball. He would fire to the left of the second Tiger, hit the tree, and the shell would deflect, he calculated, directly into the flank of the exposed third Tiger. It was a lunatic's proposal. Tank shells were not designed for ricochets. They often shattered on impact. The angles were a nightmare to calculate. The margin for error was 0. And he would have to do it with a gun that didn't shoot straight to begin with. Evans was speechless. He looked at Jack as if he'd lost his mind. "You want to bounce a tank shell off a tree?" "Yes, sir," Jack said. "My barrel consistently pulls left and low. I know by exactly how much. I'll use that. I'll aim not where the shell should go, but where I know it will go, so that after it ricochets, it goes where we need it to go. I'm not straightening the barrel, sir. I'm using the curve." It was the antithesis of everything Evans believed in. It was chaos. It was anarchy. It was a desperate gamble based on a backwoods mechanic's folk wisdom. But as he looked at Jack's face, lit by the dim glow of the instrument lights, he saw no madness there. He saw only a fierce, absolute certainty. He saw the look of a man who understood his tools. Lieutenant David Evans, West Point graduate, made a decision. He threw the book away. "Do it," he whispered. Then louder, "Do it, Miller." The inside of Fortune's Fool became a scene of frantic, focused activity. Riley, bleeding and pale, propped himself up and prepared another AP round. "You're crazy, Montana. But it's a hell of a way to go. Up." Jack loaded the round. "Preacher, you ready on the manual traverse?" "Ready, brother." "On my mark, now." Jack guided him. Left, hold. The turret creaked to a stop. Jack was not aiming at a tank. He was aiming at a thick, gnarled pine tree about 100 yards away, at a point about 10 feet off the ground. To any other gunner, it would have been a pointless, even cowardly, target. To Jack, it was the key to the entire fight. Through his scope, he could see the third Tiger. It was edging forward, its commander cautious. In a few seconds, it would be in the perfect kill zone for his ricochet. But it would only be exposed for a moment. The second Tiger, confused by their lack of fire and their turret being pointed away from it, grew bold. It began to advance again, its guns still trained on them. They were now caught between two behemoths, with a third solution that existed only in one man's mind. "Jack, any time now would be good," Riley said, his voice strained. Jack's hands were steady. He was no longer in a tank in Germany. He was in a sun-baked yard in Kansas, throwing a bent iron bar at a marker post. He was not fighting the imperfection. He was partnering with it. He calculated the wind, the range, the cold's effect on the barrel metal, the known leftward drift of his gun, the angle of the tree, the probable deflection angle, the speed of the target. It was an immense, intuitive calculation. The third Tiger nosed into the open. Its long, vulnerable side was exposed. "Here we go," Jack murmured. He took a final, slight adjustment, aiming a full 2 feet to the right and a foot above his intended impact point on the tree. He was trusting the curve, trusting his father, trusting himself. He squeezed the trigger. The gun roared. The shell, a solid shot of tungsten steel, left the crooked barrel and began its impossible journey. For a fraction of a second, it flew straight, a gray blur against the darker gray of the forest. Then it struck the pine tree dead center on the spot Jack had chosen. There was a deafening crack-wang of sound, the unique note of high-velocity metal meeting unyielding wood. A huge chunk of the tree exploded into splinters. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed the shell had simply disintegrated. But it hadn't. The shell, incredibly, held together. Deflected by the immense force of the impact, it changed trajectory, carving a new path through the air. It screamed across the road, a banshee wail of redirected energy, and slammed directly into the side of the third Tiger, just behind its tracks. This time, there was no doubt. The armor on the Tiger's flank was thick, but it was flat, not sloped. The AP shell punched through it like a fist through paper. Inside the German tank, the world ended. The hit triggered a catastrophic ammunition explosion. The Tiger erupted, its turret hurled from its ring by the force of the blast, its hull splitting open like a rotten fruit. A fireball rolled into the sky, illuminating the entire forest clearing in a sudden, garish orange light. The second Tiger, which had been advancing on Fortune's Fool, stopped dead. Its turret stopped traversing. The commander, utterly bewildered, had just seen his companion obliterated by a shot that had seemingly come from nowhere, from an angle that was geometrically impossible. He had no target, no understanding of what had just happened. The ghost had been slain by a ghost. Inside Fortune's Fool, there was no cheering, only a profound, stunned silence. Riley was the first to speak, his voice a mix of agony and awe. You banked the shot. You actually banked the shot off a tree." Lieutenant Evans looked at Jack Miller, really looked at him, for the first time. He saw not a problematic sergeant, but a master of his craft. He saw the genius he had been too blind to see. In that moment, the rulebook was burned to ashes. But the battle wasn't over. The second tiger was still there, confused but lethal. And behind it, the rest of the convoy was still waiting. They had killed 2 tigers. But the hammer was still falling, and the anvil was cracked and spent. The sudden silence was more unnerving than the battle noise. The second tiger had withdrawn slightly, using the burning wreck of its comrade for cover. It was a temporary reprieve. The smell of diesel, cordite, and roasted meat filled the air inside Fortune's Fool. Riley's breathing was becoming more shallow. Preacher had managed to get the engine to sputter, but it produced no power. The transmission was shot. They were still immobile. Evans slumped against the turret basket, the adrenaline crash leaving him hollowed out. He had faced the end and had been saved by a miracle he still didn't understand. The shame of his earlier panic washed over him. He had failed as a commander. It was Jack, the man he'd dismissed, who had held them together. Jack himself felt the weight of what he had done. He had taken a principle from a peaceful life and turned it into an instrument of terrifying destruction. He saw the burning tigers, the men inside them who had been vaporized by his ingenuity. There was no glory in it, only a cold, grim necessity. His father's lesson had saved his life, but at the cost of others. The morality of it was a knot he couldn't untangle. He looked at his crew. Evans, broken. Riley, bleeding out. Preacher, exhausted. They were at the end of their strength. The crooked barrel had given them one impossible victory. But it couldn't give them another. They were out of tricks, out of time, and out of hope. The rumble of the remaining Tiger tanks was growing louder as they regrouped. The final assault was coming. In the quiet, Jack closed his eyes. He wasn't praying. He was just remembering. The feel of the Kansas sun on his face. The weight of the bent iron bar in his small hand. His father's voice, steady and sure. You remember the curve. He had. And now, it was all he had left. The low growl of the remaining tigers organizing for a final, coordinated push broke the stillness. There were at least 3 more behind the cautious second tank. They would not be tricked again. They would advance together, overwhelming the lone, crippled Sherman with sheer, brute force. Evans looked at Jack, his eyes those of a subordinate now, not a commander. Miller, can you do it again? Another ricochet. Jack shook his head, his eye still pressed to the sight. No, sir. They're staying close to the trees, but not in the right positions. There's no geometry for it. A direct shot is our only option. A direct shot won't work, Evans said, the panic threatening to return. Against the front plate, no, Jack agreed. His mind was racing, scrolling through his father's notebook in his mind's eye. Flaws. Stress points. The curve. He thought about the Tiger's one well-known, but fiendishly difficult to hit, weakness. The shot trap. The underside of the massive, overhanging gun mantlet. If you could hit the curved base of the mantlet just right, a shell could deflect downward, through the thin armor of the hull roof, and into the crew compartment. It was a 1-in-a-million shot, requiring perfect angle, timing, and a massive amount of luck. But Jack didn't believe in luck. He believed in predictable flaws. The shot trap, he said aloud. The shot trap. Riley groaned from the floor. Jack, that's a fairy tale. No one makes that shot. We have to, Jack said, a new plan crystallizing. But I can't hit it head-on. The angle is wrong. Our gun, our crooked gun, it fires low and left. If I aim for the center of his mantlet, our shell will impact low. Exactly where we need it to for the shot trap. It was the ultimate irony. The flaw that had plagued him, that had gotten him demerits, that Evans had seen as a mark of his incompetence, was now the one thing that made the impossible shot possible. His gun, natural inaccuracy, was the perfect correction for the precise geometry of the shot trap. Evans understood immediately. A wild, desperate hope flashed in his eyes. You're sure? As sure as I can be, Jack said. He had no more data. No more calculations. This was the final application of the philosophy. Using the curve for one last, desperate throw. Then do it, Evans said, his voice filled with a new respect, a total faith. Take the shot, Sergeant. The second tiger, emboldened by the lack of fire, began its advance. It was coming straight for them, its commander no doubt believing the American tank was finally dead. It was presenting its strongest armor, its gun leveled for the kill. It was the straightest, most predictable barrel in the world. And Jack Miller, with his crooked barrel, was ready to teach it a lesson. The final act began. Preacher, with what little strength he had left, used the manual traverse to help Jack make the microscopic adjustments. The turret moved in tiny, jerking increments. The tiger was 250 yards away and closing. It was a colossal, terrifying sight filling Jack's scope. Steady, steady, Jack murmured, more to himself than to Preacher. Riley, with a final Herculean effort, dragged himself up and loaded the last armor-piercing round they had. It was their final shell. The last card in the deck. Last one, Jack, he gasped, slamming the breech block closed before collapsing back to the floor. Make it count. Up, Jack confirmed, his voice a whisper. The tiger was 200 yards away. 180. Its own gun was beginning to elevate for the final shot. Jack could see the German commander's head in the cupola, a tiny, confident figure. He centered his crosshairs. But he didn't aim for the shot trap. He aimed for the center of the tiger's gun mantlet, the thickest part of its armor. According to the book, it was a useless shot. But according to Jack's intimate knowledge of his own weapon's soul, it was the only shot. He knew his shell would not go where the crosshairs were pointed. It would fly low and left. It would strike the curved base of the mantlet, and if God or physics or his father was listening, it would deflect down into the heart of the beast. 150 yards. He took a breath. The world dissolved. There was no tank, no war, no forest. There was only the curve, the target, and the man who bridged the gap between them. He was not a soldier anymore. He was a mechanic, solving one last vital problem. 120 yards. Point-blank range. He exhaled slowly. His finger took up the slack on the trigger. The tiger's gun flashed. Time did not slow down. It shattered. The tiger fired first. The 88mm shell was a blur of motion. It struck Fortune's Fool on the upper glassy plate. There was an ear-splitting clang of metal on metal, a sound so profound it felt like the sky itself had been torn. The shell did not penetrate. It ricocheted upward, tearing a long, deep gouge in the armor before screaming off into the forest. But the force of the impact was devastating. The shock wave threw everyone inside against the hard steel surfaces. Lights flickered and died. Instruments shattered. Jack was thrown back from his sight, his forehead striking the hard edge of the gunner's station. Stars exploded in his vision. Blood trickled into his eye. For a moment, he was blind, disoriented. Miller. Jack. Evans was screaming. The gun. Fire the gun. The tiger was still coming. It had missed its kill shot, but it was now only 80 yards away. It would not miss again. Jack shook his head, blinking through the blood and dizziness. He forced himself back to the eyepiece. The world was a red-hazed, tilting blur. He could barely see. He fumbled for the traversing handles. His hands were numb. He found the tiger in the sight. It was a monstrous, blurry shape. He couldn't make out the details. He couldn't see the mantlet. He was aiming by instinct alone, by the memory in his muscles, by the ghost of his father's hand on his shoulder. He didn't have time to aim. He didn't have time to think. He had only the curve. He squeezed the trigger. The gun fired. The shell left the barrel. Jack, half-conscious, never saw it strike. But Evans, from his cupola, did. The shell flew, as Jack knew it would, low and to the left of where a perfect gun would have placed it. It struck the lower curved lip of the tiger's gun mantlet. For a nanosecond, it seemed to stick there, as if deciding its path. Then, obeying the immutable laws of physics, it deflected downward, vanishing into the thin, vertical armor of the Tiger's hull roof. There was a pause. A heartbeat of silence. Then, a muffled whump from inside the German tank. Smoke began to pour from every hatch and vision slit. The Tiger rolled forward another 10 feet, its engine still running, a ghost ship steered by dead men, before it gently nudged against a tree and stopped. Its gun, which had been moments from firing the shot that would have annihilated them, sagged toward the ground. The last Tiger in the immediate kill zone was dead. The crooked barrel had spoken its last, perfect word. The destruction of the second Tiger broke the will of the convoy. The remaining Tigers, their path blocked by 3 of their own burning wrecks, their commanders confused and demoralized by the supernatural accuracy of the lone American tank, made the decision to withdraw. The low rumble of their engines faded, moving back down the forest road from whence they came. The battle was over. Silence descended upon the clearing, broken only by the crackle of flames and the pinging of hot metal. The anvil had held. The hammer had been broken. Inside Fortune's Fool, the silence was absolute. It was several minutes before any of them could speak. Evans was the first to move, slumping down into the turret, his body trembling with the aftershocks of terror and awe. He looked at Jack, who was still at his station, head bowed, blood dripping steadily from his brow onto his lap. "Medic," Evans croaked, his voice barely audible. "We need a medic for Riley." "For Miller." Preacher, exhausted, managed to get the driver's hatch open and waved a ragged shirt to the American infantry, who were now tentatively emerging from their positions. The threat was gone. Jack finally raised his head. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt empty, drained of everything. He had used his father's gift, the philosophy of the curve, and it had worked with a terrifying efficiency. He had saved his crew. He had stopped the convoy. But the cost felt immense. The hatches were opened fully, letting in the cold, smoke-tainted air. It was the first fresh air they had breathed in hours. The scene outside was one of utter devastation. The blackened, shattered hulks of the Tigers stood as grim monuments to the ferocity of the fight. The forest around them was scorched and torn. A medic clambered up onto the hull and dropped inside, immediately going to work on Riley's leg. Another tended to Jack's head wound, cleaning the blood away and applying a bandage. Evans climbed out of the cupola and stood on the back of the tank, looking out at the road they had held. He saw the results of Jack's impossible shots, the Tiger killed by the ricochet, the Tiger killed by the shot trap. He saw the body of the first Tiger, slain by a conventional shot that should never have worked. He saw the bent, broken pine tree that had been the instrument of their salvation. He looked down into the turret at Jack Miller. The maverick. The problem child. The genius. "Sergeant," Evans said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was wrong. About you. About everything. You saved us all." Jack just nodded slowly. He didn't need the praise. The validation was in the silence, in the fact that he and his crew were still breathing. He reached into his pocket and felt the familiar shape of his father's leather-bound notebook. It was still there. A little piece of Kansas in the heart of the German forest. A reminder that even in a world of straight lines and rigid rules, there was always a place for the curve. The aftermath was a slow-motion dream. Recovery vehicles arrived, their winches groaning as they dragged the crippled Fortune's Fool back from the front line. Jack, Evans, and Preacher walked beside the stretcher carrying Riley to an ambulance. The freezing rain had started again, washing the soot and blood from the steel and the frozen earth. They were sent to a field hospital for rest and observation. Days blurred into one another. The story of the crooked barrel and the crew that stopped a Tiger convoy began to spread through the division, growing with each telling. To the high command, it was a tactical miracle. To the men in the lines, it was a legend. But for Jack Miller, it was just a memory. A series of moments defined by sound and fear and the application of a simple principle. He never spoke of it much. When asked, he would just shrug and say, "We got lucky." The war ground on. They were given a new tank, a new commander when Evans was promoted, but the soul of Fortune's Fool went with them. Jack fought through the rest of the war, his reputation as a preternatural gunner preceding him. He used his skill when he had to, but he never again had to rely on it so completely, so desperately. When the war finally ended, he went home to Kansas. He took over his father's mechanic business, his hands once again growing familiar with grease and steel, with the predictable flaws of pumps and pistons. He married, had children, grew old watching the sun set over the Flint Hills. He never threw a bent iron bar again. But he kept his father's notebook on a shelf in his workshop, its pages now filled with his own notes alongside his father's. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, he would take it down and look at it. Not at the formulas or the diagrams, but at his father's handwriting. He had proven the philosophy in the most extreme laboratory on Earth. He had learned that a flaw understood is a weapon more powerful than perfection. And he knew, with a certainty that went deeper than bone, that the straight path is not always the true one, and that sometimes the most direct route to victory is a crooked line, fired from a crooked barrel, by a man who was brave enough to trust the curve. The story of Jack Miller is a testament to the fact that true genius often lies outside the manual, in the courage to think differently when it matters most. If this story of impossible courage and forgotten history resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And let me know in the comments, what other untold stories of World War II heroism should we uncover next? Thanks for watching.